My lords, as you know, our galaxy is a dangerous place. I have, over the past year or two, detailed many accounts of brutal genocide and destruction of both spacefaring and primitive empires at the hands of would-be galaxy destroyers. Today, however, I have something a little different for you. I have several accounts of empires who destroyed themselves in deliberate acts of empire-wide suicide. These once mighty empires took it upon themselves to remove their entire populace from the galactic stage. Several had their reasons, i.e. the Zroni, but for others the reasons are unclear, or we simply cannot understand them. I shall detail them for you now, beginning with the Siab'ians. Dr. Simmons reports on the Siab'ians in a report classified as Anyone Home. Our survey ship has scanned Cybora 3 and detected some artificial structures which I believe are worth a closer look. Unnervingly, there are no signs of any population activity on the planet, pointing to the fact that we suspect a civilization once lived there, but was subsequently destroyed. Indeed, this does appear to be a planet of ghosts. Our surface expedition has reported back some astounding findings. The planet has multiple cities, all of which are abandoned, but in quite good shape considering their age. The infrastructure and urban planning of each city is remarkably structured and harmonious, which indicates a highly cohesive civilization driven by a centralized collective ideal, perhaps even a Gestalt consciousness of some kind. Based on the architecture and interior fixtures, the species that built all of this appears to have been smaller than us and with a fairly low state of technological advancement. Where exactly they all went remains unknown, and thus we will keep digging. Several months have now passed since my last report on the civilization of Cybora 3. Sadly, this has led to more questions than answers. The planet-side structures are thousands of years old, and all seem to have been constructed at roughly the same time, perhaps as briefly as within a single century. Similarly, any additions or renovation to the urban structures seem to have been completed planet-wide at a sudden but widely separated interval. The oddly punctuated development of the society seems to show no appreciable change in population size. To speak plainly, it's as though they only did the building once every 1,000 years, and then took a rather large rest. Their reasons remain unclear, and thus we shall keep digging. Fortunately, within a matter of weeks we had a breakthrough that shone some light on the vanished city builders that once occupied this planet. Apparently, the fungal species that once lived here has a collective cycle of mass death and rebirth. They hatch en masse almost simultaneously across the entire planet, and then they grow up as part of a linked hive mind collective. In the course of their hundreds of years long life cycle, they spread out and reclaim the cities built and abandoned by the previously dead generations. When nearing the next death-rebirth event, they heed some species-wide biological clarion call. Through asexual reproduction, they give birth to a pod that they bury deep in the ground. The parent dies, the body dies and fertilizes the ground around the pod. The pod hatches, and the cycle begins again. A speculative psychological and sociological investigation of the fungoid species culture gave us a disconcerting answer to the mystery of their disappearance. But the question must be asked, if this was their life cycle, then what changed? Well, we have the answer. It would appear at some point that the species as a whole began to question their perpetual and seemingly pointless life cycle. A seed of existential nihilism grew in the entire population that culminated in a final act of defiance against their survival instinct. Once planted, perhaps even by a single being, this kernel of doubt spread with terrifying speed through the hive mind, until it was decided in unison that the last crop of birth pods should simply not be planted. They should be burned. Thus, collectively, the entire hive mind simply decided to not reproduce, and they killed their entire species in this act. A dark ending indeed, and it remains unclear to this day why the hive mind decided to do this. Nevertheless, it is always difficult to explain the mind of a Gestalt consciousness. The Bayu. Next, we have another plantoid hive mind, who we have designated the Bayu. Dr. Cackle reports on this long-dead race we found during routine investigation of the third planet in system, Bayu 3. Initial scanning of the Bayu system has identified little of note. However, in orbit of the third planet in system, we picked up a weak communication ping of a decaying space station, and upon deeper inspection of the planet, it became clear that a plantoid pre-FTL hive mind once lived upon the planet. The space station would appear to be an observation station, occupied by a different empire who, like we do on occasion, was observing the hive mind from orbit. Sadly, all the observation post data storage units had been wiped. Extensive care had been taken to eliminate any evidence that could lead us back to its owners, and perhaps for good reason, as something clearly went wrong planetside. The only signs that intelligent life once occupied this world were the crumbling husks of half-finished megacities, seemingly abandoned mid-construction and scattered across the surface of the planet. There is, however, a single looming and extremely large temple in the middle of what we assume to be the capital city. Thus, we've gone planetside in the hope for answers as to what happened here. But despite their efforts at secrecy, traces of the observers' clumsy meddling are everywhere across the planet. Several weeks have now passed, and evidence suggests that the planet was inhabited by a psionically linked consciousness of plantoids that were in the midst of a religious awakening, when a mysterious alien race, referred to only as the Gatekeepers, descended upon them without warning. From that point on, the plantoids became obsessed with the idea of an impending apocalyptic event called the Grey Tempest. Their formerly peaceful religion soon spiraled into a suicide cult, and within a matter of months, one of the galaxy's most ancient life forms had wilted away for fear of a doomsday that would never come. Now we break the theme of plantoid hive minds to discuss the Vultaum. The Vultaum are likely the most well-known empire who underwent a doctrine of mass suicide. They are, of all the ancient precursor races I've had the pleasure of researching, the oddest by far. They occupied our galaxy approximately 12 million years ago. They were a hyper-advanced, dominant empire who were a race of worm-like annelids, approximately 3 to 4 meters in length, and they communicated primarily through vibrations carried along their segmented bodies. They were long-lived, surviving naturally approximately 270 Earth years. The Vultaum seem to have ignored the normally conventionally popular field of artificial intelligence, instead focusing exclusively on virtual realities, virtual existence, massive computer simulations, and for lack of a better description, video games. Quite how these simulations were maintained and operated without the appropriate computing power of an AI is beyond our understanding. In any case, a substantial amount of information regarding their culture comes from ancient copies of these video games. One in particular, seemingly it was a multi-user virtual reality game enjoyed by billions of their population across the Empire. Other than what we know from the Vultaum's video games, we've learned from beacons designed to relay a quite unusual message. It would appear that at some point, the Vultaum became obsessed with what they call the true existence, and began to issue instruction that sentient beings must disconnect. Evidence suggests not all in the Vultaum followed this unknown philosophy. We have dig sites showing splinter groups who firmly did not follow the doctrine. They also appear to have existed beyond the wider collapse of Vultaum society. As we dig more into their culture, it seems that at almost every turn their settlements followed a similar path. They were destroyed, but not from war or disease. It would appear that self-destruction was the culprit. Ranging from space stations, mining facilities, and outer colonies, all were destroyed, and often by antimatter bombs deliberately detonated by the Vultaum themselves. It is not until we finally identified and explored their homeworld that we understood the true extent of the Vultaum's descent into madness. Their homeworld while ravaged by a number of massive antimatter explosions, gave us the information required to finish the story. Approximately a century before their extinction, the Vultaum experienced a radical shift in ideology. The why still remains unclear, but the new philosophy posited that the entire universe they occupied, and the one that we now live in, was in fact an artificial reality, which all sapient beings have been unwittingly plugged into for the amusement of some higher power. Thus, they undertook increasingly radical attempts to forcefully disconnect from the simulation, most of which involved mass suicide. The Vultaum finally concluded that only the simultaneous disconnection of billions of individuals would destabilize the system enough to grant them freedom. At an agreed upon hour, Vultaum across the galaxy killed themselves by any and all means available, often in the form of gigantic antimatter bombs. Those Vultaum who saw through the madness and refused to take part in the mass suicide were too few to repopulate the species, and so the Vultaum faded into obscurity and eventual extinction. Some of our top scientists researching the matter appear to have gone a little too far down the rabbit hole on this one, and are telling us that the Vultaum had it right, if you can believe it. They were quickly removed from their posts and have been disassociated with the government. The Zroni. The final empire I'll discuss who underwent a mass suicide is the Zroni Empire, or at least a significant proportion of it. The Zroni were the most powerful psionics to have ever graced our galaxy. They would humble even the mighty Holy Guardians who exist today. All we know of the Zroni is catalogued from psionic crystals which they use to contain their memory and emotions. It is a technology far beyond what we have managed to accomplish. The first of these crystals was found in the center of a perfectly untouched city. Normally with dead planets, you'll find signs of death and destruction, but not so here. It was as if the inhabitants simply vanished overnight. Other than the city itself and a light blue dust, there was no sign that life ever existed in this place. However, it is here that we first learned of the Zroni existence and their psionic capabilities. If our interpretations are correct, the Zroni, upon exploring the Shroud, made contact with the beings who occupy it. It's unclear if a bargain was made, but from here on out, their power exploded. They learned to psionically enter the Shroud and acquired the ability to manipulate its essence to their whim. They created a utopia unlike anything that had ever been seen. Furthermore, they learned that the Shroud touches all physical space simultaneously. They had the ability to enter at one physical point and psionically jump to any other part of the known galaxy. It is perhaps because of this power that we found little evidence of expansion. The Shroud, it seems, would envelop their entire culture, science, entertainment, and all walks of life were pushed aside in order to fuel the need to enter the Shroud. We don't know exactly when, but at some point the Zroni learned that their new powers would come at a cost. They learned that the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy, the same one that we see today, was growing, and it became clear that this was fueling their ability to manipulate the Shroud. With every change the Zroni made, the black hole grew larger, consuming the mass of the physical galaxy and siphoning the energy back to the Shroud. This discovery would shape the way the Zroni civilization would come to an end. Debate engulfed the Zroni civilization, and two sides formed, the Divine and the Saviors. Argument led to division, and division turned into a fully fledged civil war. The Divine felt that the fate of the physical galaxy was no concern of theirs. They would continue to live as gods within the Shroud, irrespective of what happened to the rest of the galaxy. The Saviors were aghast at this. They had no wish to live as parasites, preying on other races. Siphoning energy from the physical world to fuel their base desires was abhorrent to this group. Besides, even without their ability to enter and manipulate the Shroud, their psionics still guaranteed them a near-utopian existence. The majority of the Zroni population sided with the Saviors, and this gave the Saviors a great advantage. However, the Divine became unshackled and able to use the full might of the Shroud, whereas the Saviors were limited to the power that they could draw from within their own bodies. In any other war this would have been enough, but the power of the Shroud was immense, and at this point the Divine was sure to win the war. That is until a discovery was made by a savior scientist. He theorized that he could turn his power upon itself and consume himself in a chain reaction. He put the theory into action, and all that remained was a dusty residue. That residue is what we now know to be Zro. This dust was essentially the sum of his total psionic potential, and could be used by another Zroni to extend their abilities far beyond what they could accomplish alone. This great sacrifice began to turn the tide of the war. The Divine began to lose and were becoming increasingly desperate. In their desperation, they spawned ever-increasing horrors, shaping the Shroud into beings beyond all measure of rage and madness. The war, it would seem, was not over yet, and would not end with victory for either side. The Divine had fallen beyond all measure of reason. They decided to enact their ultimate plan, the end of the cycle. They would expend untold energy in order to grow the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy, effectively wiping out the galaxy and the saviors with it. Fortunately for us, this did not happen. The saviors, faced with annihilation, made their way to the capital world of Zroni, a world that still exists today, however one cleaved by psionic energy. It is here that the saviors made the ultimate sacrifice to stop the Divine madness. Every savior, except one, consumed themselves, channeling the power of their entire species into this single Zroni. The lone Zroni used this immense power to end the existence of the Divine and killing himself in the process. In the snap of a finger, the Zroni were totally annihilated and turned to dust, thus ending the threat of the Divine for good. Or so we thought. Thanks for watching, folks. If you want to hear more from me, please click the video on screen now.